I'm Joni Jones, co-president of the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara. It's my pleasure to welcome members, Santa Barbara community, and our guest speakers, and all of us. I'm doing a few announcements this morning, and we're taping. I would invite all of you to consider joining the League. And for this remainder of our year through June, we have a special. So it's $25 to join, and then you'll be notified, you'll be on the rolls, and you'll receive our annual renewal letter in July or August. On Tuesday, March 24th, you have on your table an announcement that we are hosting an evening forum. It is Immigration and the Vote. Join us at 7 o'clock in this room, Louise Lowry Davis. The flyers are for your use, and please spread it around to your friends. We're also involved in Earth Day. Join us in the League's participation of a table at Earth Day on Saturday, April 18th and Sunday the 19th. You can help us staff our booth. Please sign up on the clipboard today, and it's out there waving around in Charlene Little's hand. Our local election study on district versus at-large unit discussion meetings will be the first week. All of our units will be the first week, full week of April 6th, 7th, and 8th. Please note the Valverde is going to be on the 6th. This topic will affect many cities in California because of the California Voting Rights Act. Our final newsletter, The Channel Voter, will be emailed on March 30th or around April 1st. And please look for it. Look for it on our website. And for those of you who do not have email or any computer, it will be mailed if you are a member. Please save the date for our annual meeting. It will be in the same place it was last year at the Trinity Lutheran. It will be June 13th. Now, we have Emily Allen, who is our League co-chair of social policy. She works for the Legal Aid Foundation and for Common Ground, Santa Barbara County. And she will be moderating and speaking at this event. And she'll tell you more about Common Ground. I do want to mention that we have a little box in the back that Amanda's holding up, and that all of these, the taping and the presenting of this and renting of this room costs a lot of money. And so through the years, you may not be a member or want to be a member of the League of Women Voters, but you are welcome to do that also. But you can contribute anytime you wish. Any amount of money is welcome. Thank you. And here's Emily Allen.
So, good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. And my first job is to give you a little bit of an overview of what we learned through the recent 2015 vulnerability survey and point-in-time count. So, Stephen, keep going. Okay, so January 28th and 29th was the big vulnerability survey and point-in-time count. And once again, our county had amazing volunteer participation. The first year we did it in 2011, 500 volunteers in our county came out and participated. And in 2013 and 2015, over 600 volunteers came out and participated. So Santa Barbara County really is quite amazing in the level of community participation and engagement around this issue. And these volunteers and the people who participated in the survey helped provide some really valuable information for our county. And it was done countywide, and it included people who lived in on the streets, in vehicles, and in shelters. And we used tools of engagement, which we use doing outreach, things like socks and cereal bars, and $5 gift cards for people who were willing and agreed to participate in the survey. So since 2003, all continuums of care communities, and that in Santa Barbara is our county, have been required to conduct what's called a point-in-time count of people experiencing homelessness. And that's just a count. It's a snapshot. It does not in any way purport to count every person who's experiencing homelessness, but it gives us that snapshot. And it's required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so it is counting people who meet the core definition of HUD's homeless definition, which are individuals and families living in places not meant for human habitation, individuals and families residing in shelter, and individuals and families residing in transitional housing. So chronically homeless is a term that you might have heard or, be familiar with, but it's good to just go over the definition quickly. It's an individual experiencing homelessness or head of household with a disabling condition who's been continuously homeless a year or more, or an individual head of household with a disabling condition who's had at least 4 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. People experiencing chronic homelessness tend to be more visible and more vulnerable, and chronic homelessness is also considered to be costly to communities. So the vulnerability survey is something that we as a community decided we wanted to use back in 2011, and that we would do it in conjunction with our point-in-time count. And the vulnerability survey gathers additional self-reported data on people experiencing homelessness. So, and this really, ties back to these principles that to effectively address homelessness in our community, we must know every person experiencing homelessness by name. And I think this is a really important one. And that we must carefully assess the health and housing needs of every person experiencing homelessness, and rigorously track and measure progress on an ongoing basis, making calculated adjustments to track and improve performance. And that's performance around reducing homelessness. Target resources to the most vulnerable individuals and families quickly and predictably. So the VI SPDAT is the new tool that we used in 2015, and it really combines the vulnerability survey, which is it enables us to rapidly assess people, but it also gives then information on how to prioritize housing and services for people. And what that means really is that, it doesn't make sense to put somebody who really needs housing with supportive services so I actually want to switch that. It doesn't make sense to put somebody who doesn't need housing with supportive services in a housing with supportive service unit, because that really needs to be reserved for the person who needs that level of care. And so to use limited resources wisely, we need to engage in this prioritization. So this year also we used a new tool. I know people in this room have participated in various vulnerability surveys here in Santa Barbara County, and traditionally we've used a paper tool. This year we used a tool that could be administered on your smartphone or tablet, which allowed us to immediately upload the data. It increases efficiency and reduces, data entry error. It was amazingly effective. Most of the surveys were completed using smartphones and tablets, and it's a tool that we can actually continue to use year-round so that we can update the list of, people who are vulnerable and experiencing homelessness, and it can be much more, real-time data. Okay, so we'll go over some of this sort of quickly, but what did we learn going out and gathering this information? We really saw not huge amounts of drastic change when you look at the 2011, 2013, and 2015 data. So you can see the numbers there. In 2011, 1,536 people In 2015, 1,455. And you'll see there's some changes within regions and in that respect. So this is the regional information, so all the cities within the county. You can see not drastic change from region to region. Some decreases over time in the city of Santa Barbara, some increases, especially in Santa Maria, that could possibly be a trend. It's hard to know when you're just gathering data every 2 years, though, to really know if there are changes or trends. We need to be gathering data really on a daily basis. So distribution by region, and all of these charts and graphs are available on the C3H website, which we'll show you later, and also the Common Ground website, so you can take a look at these charts and graphs in more detail. But this shows you, distribution. How are people experiencing homelessness? So, some people are living on the street, but other people are living in vehicles and shelters and transitional housing. So, the location prior to becoming homelessness. 54% of 2015 survey respondents report that they lived in Santa Barbara County prior to becoming homeless. So, there are definitely people who come from from outside of Santa Barbara County, but a lot of people who become homeless, lived in the county before becoming homeless. So, general demographic data, 83 is the oldest person that we surveyed this year. We do see that Santa Barbara has a higher percentage of people who are elderly experiencing homelessness, and just other demographic data. So many people coming out of foster care, victims of domestic violence and trauma, lots of people using ER and hospital, very high percentage of people reporting having been to the jail. So 33% of 2015 survey respondents reporting domestic violence. This data was helpful previously in applying for a federal Violence Against Women Act grant, that we could talk about how we needed funding to do outreach to survivors who are experiencing homelessness. So this data can be helpful for that type of purpose. And veterans, you'll notice that the average age of a veteran, the time spent homeless is 8.3 years, where we saw 5.5 years for just the general population of people experiencing homelessness. So veterans are homeless for longer, and 64% having mental health diagnosis, and high percentage having post-traumatic stress disorder diagnosis. Health insurance was a good news piece, I would say. You'll see since the expansion of access to health care through the Affordable Care Act, we see 74% reporting enrollment in some form of health insurance, with a high percentage now reporting enrollment in Medi-Cal, so that's increased dramatically, and there have been outreach efforts around that, and that's, I think, very good to see. So again, other areas that the health-related, concerns. A lot of the vulnerability survey is around, really, really specific health-related questions. That helps determine how vulnerable somebody is. So this gives you, a sense of that. The traumatic brain injuries, 24%, and so 64% of survey respondents reporting mental illness, 48% reporting severe mental illness. So, those mental health needs remain high over the 2011, 2013, and 2015 surveys, and high reported rates of alcohol abuse also over all, 3 surveys. So, sort of key observations, numbers of individuals encountered remains largely unchanged over the past 3 counts. 76% of 2015 survey respondents report that they lived in Santa Barbara County or another part of the California prior to becoming homeless. Shelters and permanent supportive housing are both essential to addressing local homelessness. People experience homelessness continue to face high risk of violence, trauma, serious injury, chronic disease, and mental illness. But health insurance enrollment has increased dramatically, as I mentioned, with 74% of those surveyed reporting to be enrolled in some type of health insurance. And, you know, there, as I mentioned, strong, there were some really well-coordinated efforts around organizing enrollment for people experiencing homelessness. And approximately 15% of survey respondents self-identified as veterans with an 8.3 average length of homelessness. Keep going. So now I'd like to introduce Santa Barbara Mayor Helene Schneider, who will talk about C3H, the Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness, efforts in the city of Santa Barbara, and some national initiatives that we are involved with.
Thank you, Emily. Great crowd. Before I get started, I have to do a shameless plug because you're the League of Women Voters. You've been caring about district elections, and I want to make sure you knew tonight at 6 o'clock at Council Chambers will be another work session where all the maps that have been distributed and suggested will be going over them and having public comment and so forth. And then next Tuesday, before you come here for your 7 o'clock event, at 6 o'clock will be the council first session where we may or may not take that night to finalize on a map, and if not, that will happen on the 30th at 4 p.m. also at City Hall. So I know that's been of a big topic for you, so I just wanted to captive audience time, right? So I'm very pleased to be chair of C3H, and let me just start by saying, you know, you look at all these numbers, and it's overwhelming, and just the issue about homelessness in general is overwhelming. How do you deal with such a complex issue? Especially in Santa Barbara, it's been a complex issue literally for decades. And let me just ask around the room, how many of you have ever volunteered at a shelter, given a donation to a nonprofit that deals with homelessness, volunteered for the point in time count, anything related to, right, that's fantastic. And you know, you do what you can, and yet still there are issues related to homelessness in our community. It has impacts not only to the people who are homeless, but those who work and live here as well. And there's got to be a way that we can come together to figure out some solutions. And that is part of what C3H is all about. It's a model known as collective impact, or at least it tries to be, where we take all these different activities that are going on, all the different stakeholders and partners who focus on one particular area related to homelessness, whether it be about housing or mental illness or dealing with the Veterans Administration or food stamps or whatever it is, and try to, you know, try to put it all in alignment and have everyone reach that same kind of goal. And so and of course, the goal is reducing homelessness overall. I will say the data that I look at this data, and even though countywide we seem to be pretty flat over between 2015 back to 2011, if you look at the city of Santa Barbara numbers, and again, it's a point in time, it's a snapshot, but it's really down by 10%. And so something's happening, something's working, and the importance of data is to try to track what you can and figure out over time what seems to be working, and to focus on those strengths, and then figure out what's not working and maybe try to move that around. So a lot of what C3H does is try to bring all those different stakeholders together. And the most important thing to me in terms of what's different with C3H than with other collaboratives in the past has been how the government now is not only a major part of the policy decision-making, but they're funding this process as well. That has not happened before. There's been the 10-year plan to end chronic homelessness, which was a plan, great government intervention and connection, but no direct funding. And so the city of Santa Barbara, the county, and other cities throughout the county contribute to C3H to staff the people necessary to help coordinate all these different activities. And I want to emphasize that C3H doesn't do all the work. In fact, it's more of a hub of connecting all the dots and creating that, you know, filling in the jigsaw puzzle, whatever metaphor you want to use. But it's necessary to know what is happening throughout the county, and and also then customizing it to what works in different regions. And I know other speakers are going to talk about what's happening on a regional level, both here and perhaps elsewhere in the county. So the Policy Council, and before I get to that slide, the Policy Council consists of 10 elected officials throughout the county. There are 2 members from the County Board of Supervisors, 2 members from the City Council of Santa Barbara, 2 members from the Santa Maria City Council, and then 1 member each from Carpinteria, Goleta, Buellton, and Lompoc. And so that consists of the Policy Council to then assist all these other agencies and working efforts. And I know Zara, our interim director, is going to be talking more about the mechanics behind that, as well as Alice and Tom as well. One of the things I wanted to highlight about what's happening here in Santa Barbara, where in fact we're seeing other police departments from throughout the state calling our department and calling our chief to say, what are you doing here? We're hearing about this restorative policing and restorative court program. It's really quite innovative, but at the same time, it seems like it's so basic. It's all about relationships. It's all about how do you connect with people on the streets and figuring out what the needs are, and we're interacting with business owners and other community members in order to figure out the complex issues that surround homelessness. And instead of, for example, a business owner opening up their business in the morning and maybe there's someone hanging out in their doorway and calling 911 to say, move along, here's a process now through significant training of all of our police officers, but then also particularly designated sworn officers and other community service liaisons and the restorative outreach specialists who specifically know each of these individuals by name and know how to recognize mental illness, know how to connect, or at least do what they can to connect that individual to whatever it is that person needs. And then the other piece of, and so it's a combination of both enforcement and intervention tools there, because the police do have enforcement tools. They can arrest someone for exhibiting inappropriate or illegal behavior, not inappropriate, but illegal behavior. They can arrest someone. But sometimes there are things that I hear all the time, getting emails from various constituents or people visiting, that something that may not seem nice or it might not look nice, but it's completely legal and still has an impact. And so people sitting on a bench all day with a big shopping cart, that's not illegal. You know, people holding a sign, that's not illegal. They have free speech rights. How do you balance that out in a way? Obviously, the person needs some help, and at the same time, you can't arrest people out of homelessness. That just never works, and it's too expensive anyway. So part of this restorative policing, restorative court process is to figure out how do you combine all these different services together and really move people out of their current method of day-to-day life into something that's more sustainable, more healthy, and actually less expensive for them and for the society at large. The restorative court, and I really have to acknowledge Emily Allen, who's part of this through Legal Aid, and many others. Every week, every Wednesday morning, there's a court where our restorative officers and different stakeholders go around, and there's actually a list of people who volunteer they volunteer to go through this process. And these are individuals who may have hundreds of infractions or just a huge court file of things that one-on-one would be minor, but they've just created this backlog of infractions or maybe even misdemeanors. And a lot of it has to do with things connected to alcoholism, with mental health, and with perhaps some drug abuse, especially if you're mentally ill and you're self-medicating with drugs or alcohol, and you can see how the cycle goes around. So this process allows someone to voluntarily, instead of going to jail, to say, okay, I'm ready to step up, I'm ready to get help, and to get them the help that they need, whether it's here or sometimes it's even connecting them with services in Los Angeles or Ventura County, but there's this connection here. They have to agree to stay, to not do anything illegal, right? And to move towards self-sufficiency. And towards the end of the process, there's a graduation ceremony when actually the judge can expunge their record, which is a tremendous, tremendous help, because not only does it deal with all the backlog of court records, but for the individual, it helps that person perhaps get a job or get a driver's license or things that were barriers before for them to get, some kind of other form of service to help them be more self-sufficient. And it's just a more wraparound service, using an enforcement model when you need to, but as an incentive to move towards self-sufficiency. One of the things the council go back step. I'm almost there. One of the things the council just also did, so there's the officers who focus specifically on people who are mentally ill and homeless on our streets, mostly on State Street, the waterfront, and on Milpas. And in addition, there are people who may not be homeless who also then congregate on streets and may exhibit inappropriate behavior, or they're going in and interacting with people in ways that may seem intimidating. You need more of a presence of a police department or enforcement department. So the council decided to sort of ratchet up the community service liaison positions to more of a community service officer position. So you're going to have someone who's in uniform, has a badge but not a gun, is able to do some minor writing up of tickets or things like that, but then, if there's some major things, obviously a police officer would be nearby. And it's basically to have presence around State Street and right now for State Street. And we'll see if we can replicate that in other areas, just to really create more of a visibility and to help people interact. And then if something's really focused need on mental illness or other concerns with individuals, that's where the restorative outreach specialist and other our restored police officers can get involved. Okay, now you can go to the next one. Thank you. So I'm wearing this pin that says I'm in, and there's this very audacious goal out there happening throughout the country called the Mayor's Challenge to End Veteran Homelessness by 2015. So by December 31st, this is something First Lady Michelle Obama actually helped put forth through a lot of other federal government agencies, and saying, what if we could figure out a way to get through all the red tape and make sure that there's no vet who has served our country who will be in a situation where they will be homeless. Can't we do that? Isn't there a way that that can happen? And so there's this challenge put out there. And of course, with a challenge, you want to create a goal that could be attainable and you just reach for it, but it's a stretch. And as Emily mentioned in the data, about 15% of the point in time count numbers that we have are people who are veterans in our community. And that's pretty typical of other percentages we see around the nation. So it's about 15%, and it's a criminal that way. People who've been part of our armed services and coming back home and not having the services they need to at least have shelter. So the idea behind this is to basically figure out how can we work better with the Veteran Administration Office, how can we work better with all the different agencies involved to help and focus on veterans, but really what's going to happen with this focus is that as we find ways to help veterans get from on the streets into housing with supportive services or whatever they need, we're going to figure out where the other gaps in services are that's going to help other people who may not be veterans. It's also going to help families. If there's a vet who's homeless who's part of a family and the whole family is homeless, obviously by helping and focusing on the vet, you're going to help the whole family as well. So the point in time count data is really quite important because it gives us sort of a foundation of where do we start, who are these people. In the VI SPDAT, you have the actual individuals and who they are and how do we connect with them and how do you create a prioritization list to help them get the services they need and really focus on, if we can focus on vet housing, it's a great way of focusing on the issue as a whole. And in fact, in the county, we were doing a number of things dealing with veteran homelessness particularly, but it was kind of snapshot or staggered. And this way you're kind of focusing and aligning all those initiatives into one common goal. So for example, up in the city of Santa Maria, through County Supervisor Steve Lavanino, there's been the veteran stand down. There's been 3 now, where hundreds of vets, whether they're homeless or not, have been going to one place to get all forms of services. That is one thing that, to focus on and then figure out how do we make sure those who are homeless in the area get the services they need. In Isla Vista, there's Pescadero Lofts that just opened that's focusing a portion of their affordable housing units to veterans. The City Housing Authority just purchased a property off of Milpas Street that eventually would be a place looking for Prop 41 funds, which I believe the League supported, that passed into law last year. That's funding for housing for veterans. How do we make sure we all know what's going on and get the services and the funding, of course, that we need to provide the housing. Finally, just by showing up and being part of this Mayor's Challenge, you're part of a national conversation that's happening, so you can connect with other cities, with other counties, who are doing similar things and figuring out their best practices, so you're not reinventing the wheel, you're not starting from scratch. And I can tell you, even though we experienced homeless here in Santa Barbara, by talking to mayors across the country, it's the same story everywhere you go, even when it's 20 degrees outside as opposed to 80 in February. There are similar issues all around the country. There are close to 500 mayors who have signed up around the country to the Mayor's Challenge, as well as a few hundred county supervisors and actually some states that have done this. So it's a big, audacious goal. It's worth taking. I say, worst case scenario, that we house 75% of the veterans who are homeless as opposed to 100%. That's still pretty good. So we're doing what we can to make that happen. And again, it's all interconnected to everything else C3H is doing. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to learn about the real detailed stuff, because it's really amazing, amazing work what's happening here in the city of Santa Barbara and throughout the county. And so with that, I'm honored to welcome Alice Villarreal-Reddit to the podium. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Alice Villarreal-Reddit, and I work for the Housing Authority of the City of Santa Barbara. And today I just want to tell you a little bit about some of our efforts related to homelessness. So first, we are one of the agencies participating in the Zero 2016 campaign, which is another national initiative also aimed at ending veteran homelessness by the end of 2015 and chronic homelessness by the end of 2016. So very much aligned with the Mayor's Challenge that Mayor Schneider mentioned, as well as with the federal government's strategic plan, Opening Doors. So we hope to see these empty benches one day, and I love this hashtag. And as the mayor mentioned, this is an audacious goal. It would mean for our county consistently housing 15 veterans each month for the next 10 months. Maybe we'll get there. We hope that we will. But even if we don't, we'll come as close as we can, and we'll create systems that will foster that kind of result. One of the ways we'll do that is there's been a long-standing housing placement working group that the City Housing Authority helps to facilitate, and it's comprised of a multitude of agencies and disciplines. We get together every other Friday to basically work the VI database and to focus our efforts on prioritizing housing and services for the most long-term vulnerable. Just a little bit about the Housing Authority. We're a 45-year-old public agency that serves the city of Santa Barbara. Our mission is to provide decent, safe, and affordable housing to the community of Santa Barbara. We have two main programs. So the Section 8 Housing Choice Voucher is our largest program. We assist over 2,300 households in the community by making rental subsidy available to those households. And that means we're helping families, we're helping seniors, we're certainly helping the disabled, the mentally ill, and the homeless. We also have physical units, so over 1,300 apartments, all within the city of Santa Barbara limits. And again, those range from efficiency studios to larger family units, up to 4 and 5 bedrooms. They also range from conventional public housing to tax credit developments. And we like to think that we're an agency that's progressive and cutting edge, and that we really pay attention to the critical needs that exist within our community, whether that means responding by providing more workforce housing, or in the case of our more recent developments, El Carrillo, Bradley Studios, and Artisan, providing permanent supportive housing for the homeless. So we're very proud of those efforts. Those 3 developments alone offer the community over 170 units, with about 130 of them targeted for homeless and special needs folks. And then, as Mayor Schneider mentioned, we're in pre-development on a permanent supportive housing site for chronically homeless veterans, which we're very excited about. Again, I mentioned the housing placement calls. This is a long-standing effort. We've been doing it for 2 or 3 years now, and it's really a wonderful example of collaboration. I really believe that no one agency, no one discipline, and no one sector can end homelessness, so we really have to tackle it together, and that's what this group does. So we have nurses and social workers and city police and housing providers like myself, all in the same room, all talking about the same people, and having a database of person-specific data where we're talking about real individuals that are living in our community makes it, really meaningful and much more efficient. Let's see, Emily already mentioned some of this data, but looking at some of the statistics that came out of the 2015 survey, you can see that, among the folks that were surveyed, there is sort of this high rate of victimization and illness, and Emily mentioned that the oldest person surveyed was 83. 36% of the folks that were surveyed have multiple ER visits, so we're really talking about people that are very vulnerable and at risk. And we know that homelessness compounds these issues. It doesn't, it makes things worse. So if we believe that homelessness causes illness, and if someone already has mental illness or physical illness, it makes those conditions worse, and it makes their situation worse. I'm a native of Santa Barbara, and one of the things I love is the diversity of this community, and I believe that just as there's a diverse group of community members, there also needs to be a diverse range of housing options. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. We can't just exist on market rate housing. We have to have, a whole menu of options for the community, and that includes those that aren't suffering from homelessness. So, along this continuum of housing options, we have everything from emergency shelters to transitional housing, to more programmatic types of housing, to permanent housing. But what we know is that the real need is for more permanent supportive housing. We're making a big effort to take on more of a housing first approach, and that's considered a national best practice, which really just means that we are making it a priority to place people into housing without a lot of preconditions or expectations, no expectation of compliance with treatment or sobriety. Folks simply have the right to get into housing, and once that happens, all the social services that are available are very accessible and can really contribute in a more meaningful way to that person's well-being. Okay, so again, for the last couple years, we've been looking at this collective VI data and using it to prioritize housing and services. In the last 22 months, agencies throughout the county have been reporting their housing placements with over 902 individuals going from homelessness to housing. And that represents over 500 households. And of that number, 284 of them were chronically homeless and or vulnerable, according to the Vulnerability Index, so at a heightened risk for premature mortality. 256 of those individuals were children, and 133 were veterans. Again, just to summarize, we know that permanent housing, nothing solves homelessness like a home, right? That's what we always say. So permanent housing is essential, critical to solving homelessness, and we probably can't build our way out of the solution, so that means we need to just continue to look for creative ways to solve this crisis. In Santa Barbara County, we know that in South County alone, we have a alarmingly low vacancy rate of 0.5% as compared with the national average, which is more like 7%. So we're looking at things like master leasing and shared housing and home shares, and the agency that I work for, we're trying to promote ways to incentivize private landlords to rent to folks coming out of homelessness, and we're looking at doing some more master leasing as well. All right, so I think that's just about all I want to say. Again, taking this countywide data and then having cities and regions apply it locally in a way that responds to the needs of that individual community is sort of the way we want to go, and C3H has been very instrumental and supportive of those efforts. And I'm an affordable housing provider, so of course, I'm all for, creating additional affordable housing in the community, and I believe, again, we need it not just for the homeless, for all low-income folks, but we know that when we add to the inventory, it certainly, makes a difference and I feel like it should at least be possible for folks to get out of homelessness. Thank you. And I'll introduce Zara Nahar Moore, who's the interim director of Central Coast Collaborative on Homelessness.
Thank you, Alice, and thanks to all of you for being here today to hear more about this important issue and learn. We really are a countywide collaborative. It's really important that we have engagement from our community members, so it's really heartening to see the room so full. So I'm going to talk briefly about a little bit more about C3H, and Mayor Schneider said it really well when she said that we are a hub to connect the dots between the different stakeholders and organizations that are doing direct service work around homelessness throughout the county. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our pillars. These are 5 goals that our policy council endorsed when we got going a couple of years ago. So prevent homelessness. One of the things that we're not able to do as a community is provide support for all of the different situations that a family or an individual might come across before they're going into homelessness and make sure that they don't fall in the first time. But what we can do is prevent people from regressing back into homelessness with the needed supportive services once they've been housed. So volunteers through Common Ground Santa Barbara County in particular are a very important part of that. Once an individual or family is housed, you really want to make sure that they're not only getting the kind of clinical services that they need and that kind of support, but also support for daily living skills. As you can imagine, once people are on the street for a number of years, they sometimes don't always have the ability to do certain household day-to-day tasks in the same way that we take for granted. So volunteers can play a really important role in providing support and friendship to people as they're learning how to grocery shop, maintain a home, keep a property in good condition, and all of those things. Our second pillar is support the expansion of housing for the homeless. So as my colleagues have mentioned, one of the things that we know to a certainty is that there's not enough affordable housing here in Santa Barbara County. So it's really important to look at creative housing solutions. As Alice mentioned, we're really excited about a program that is being led by Social Venture Partners, which Tom Sloan is going to talk about in a few minutes, to create incentives for private landlords to rent to people transitioning out of homelessness. Because, as Alice said, we're not going to build our way out of this problem. So while we need some new construction of affordable properties, we also need to look at how to make the most of existing units that private landlords own. Our third pillar, build a results and data-driven culture. One of the ways that we have done this is by working with partners to bring tools like the VI SPDAT that Emily talked about to Santa Barbara County. We always want to make sure that we're using the best practices, the best technology, and the new information that's been tested and is evidence-based within our community for improved outcomes and better results. And one of the things that has also changed is that in the past couple of years, the City Housing Authority is collecting this housing placement data, so we know who's getting housed on a month-to-month basis, where there are gaps, where we need improvements, and that kind of thing. Our fourth pillar, elevate community dialogue, support, and collaboration regarding homelessness. So one of the things that we do is what we're here today talking about, having forums with members of the public and partners and other stakeholders to talk about these issues and talk about what's being done to solve them. We also, I'm going to talk in a moment about our regional coordination efforts that are going on throughout the county that my colleague Jeff Schaefer is leading up, because that's another important way that support and collaboration is really being elevated. And then finally, encourage commitment to self-sufficiency. So self-sufficiency can mean very different things depending on the individual or family. For some, it means being able to go out and get a job or pursue volunteer opportunities once housed. For others who are higher acuity, it just means being able to stay focused and committed to their own health and well-being, and in many cases, recovery. So Alice mentioned a little bit about this, but our Policy Council also endorsed 3 best practice housing strategies when we got going a couple of years ago: Housing Ready, Housing First, and Reunification. So Housing Ready is an intervention that really works for individuals and families who do not require a high level of supportive services. Then they tend to be folks who have maybe fallen on hard times or down on their luck, and they might transition out of programmatic housing into a permanent unit, but they're not going to need a really intensive level of supportive services. Housing First, on the other hand, is for the set of clients who are chronically homeless, often with a disabling condition, who are not going to get well if they continue to live on the street. So the idea is you get them into housing as quickly as possible, and then you provide the needed wraparound supportive services to help them get well and ideally stay in that housing. And then the third is reunification, and this is something that is happening through restorative policing and restorative court, where you have individuals who can safely be reunited with a family member, whether they're in this community or in another community, and live with that family member, or maybe go back to a job or a treatment program that they were in previously and can get into again if it's safe and in everyone's best interests. So I mentioned regional coordination. So you see the purpose up on the screen. Essentially, this came out of the understanding that the best way to get people into housing with the wraparound services that they need is by working with partners that know the individuals within a particular community and know the different service providers in the general landscape, and they can then work to implement best practices to help get people housed. So we want to have the broader county-wide structure, and we want to have these touch points that are happening throughout the county, but we also want to have a lot of the work on the ground led by people within a particular community. So each regional coordination committee sets its own goals and deliverables in coordination with the Policy Council and coordination committee partners. So that's the full C3H coordination committee that meets every other month. So you see some of the types of partners that are involved at the regional level. We have folks who are coming from the faith community. We have housing providers, county staff, city staff. Volunteers, as I mentioned, are a very important part of this. So we rely on Common Ground Santa Barbara for that. We also have private landlords, shelter providers, essentially stakeholders in the community. And I also want to mention businesses as well, because we found that one of the best ways to get solutions, and again, my colleague Tom will talk more about this in the context of talking about the Milpas project, is by having engagement from not only the people who are homeless or are serving homeless individuals, but also from stakeholders in the community that are adversely impacted by homelessness. So that's been a really exciting development under C3H. And I would invite you to visit c3homes.org to see where and when each of the regional coordination meetings is happening. We're always looking for more volunteers and engaged folks to get involved and participate in that effort as volunteers. So if you're interested, please check it out and follow up. And now I'm going to introduce my colleague Tom Sloan. He is a key leader of Social Venture Partners and also works closely with Common Ground Santa Barbara County.
Thank you, Zara, and thank you all for coming this afternoon. What I'd like to start with is talk a little bit about Social Venture Partners. What we are is we're a group of individuals where we pool our philanthropy dollars together and we work on issues in the community. It's based. I'm sorry. It's based on kind of like a venture capital model that came out of Seattle about 15, 20 years ago, and there's several chapters throughout the nation, actually international chapters as well. And what we do is we engage in a certain area of expertise, a certain area of need. In this case, it would be homelessness, and we engage different nonprofits and try to build capacity. We invest in them, but what we really try and do is we invest our time and hopefully our expertise to help build capacity in them. And what I want to talk to you today about is two initiatives that we have going in collaboration with C3H and Common Ground and all the efforts you're hearing about today. And these are programs that we have found to be best practices throughout in different communities. And the first one I want to talk about is Housing First, which we've mentioned before. And really what it is if you want to go to the next slide there, it's really dealing with the folks that are the highest need folks. So these are the chronically homeless, these are the mentally ill, these are the substance abuse folks, and they're the ones that don't fit into our normal structure. It tends to be in normal communities, it tends to be about 10 to 15% of the homeless. But these are the ones that you see as we consider, as you think about, your classic homeless person, these are the folks that come to mind. The shopping cart and the mentally ill, the chronic inebriates, those types of things. And a lot of times they don't fit into regular programs. So a traditional type program we talked about when we talked about Housing Ready is a program where you might have a shelter or a program that has requirements of sobriety, or it has to, there has to be mental illness, stability, or certain requirements to get into that. And those programs work really well for folks who are ready to make those changes and ready to go that direction. And so it's a gradual increase of I'm thinking of the word. As they're moving up the ladder, it's a gradual increase to self-sustainability. And what we find is with a lot of folks, it just doesn't work. We find a lot of folks that we see that have been chronically homeless on our streets for 10 or 15 years. They've basically been bounced out of every program in the city, sobriety-based program or whatever, and they have nowhere else to go, and so they're kind of just stuck there. Maybe they're dealing with mental illness, maybe they're duly diagnosed with substance abuse and mental illness. And so what we have is the Housing First type of program, which basically says you take that person and you give them a house first, you give them a place to stay first. And what that does is it helps to stabilize the person. That really, on the street, they're very vulnerable. You're always worried about being attacked or having some kind of, incident happen. And so just having a place to stay, we find it can help stabilize these folks. And then you can start to work on all the other issues, the mental illness issues and the addiction issues and so forth. And so this is a model that's been used throughout the country very effectively. It's based on a mental health type of a model, and it's proven highly effective. And the reason why I think it works so well is because, if you think about change and you think about even change in our own lives, it's a very difficult thing to do. And when you're talking about substance abuse or mental illness or some of these things, the highest motivation comes from internal change. And so a Housing First type model actually puts the client first. And so you actually ask them what their needs are and what do they want to do. And what that does is it creates internal motivation for change. Okay, so a lot of programs say, if you become sober, we will do this for you. So that's an external type of a motivation. And that works great for a lot of folks who are ready for that. But some folks, they need. The reason why these types of programs are so successful is because it comes from an internal motivation that is created. And so what we've seen through when we did our research on this type of a program is that it's highly effective for these types of folks that are the hardest to house. And what we see is a good program will have a 2-year retention rate of somewhere around 85%, which is really amazing because these folks are, like I said, these are the ones that have been homeless for a long time and they have a high amount of needs. It also, it improves their quality of life, obviously, but it reduces the amount of services and care that they need over time as they become healthy. And so, go ahead there. So what we see is, from a business standpoint, which I come from a business background and a lot of us do, is that this is an economic model that has a tremendous amount of potential. So what we find is that we find these types of folks that I'm talking about, the chronically homeless, is that they use a a large proportion of our community services in police contacts, in jail time, in ER visits, and et cetera. And so from a cost standpoint, when you take these folks and you can actually get them housed and wrap them around with some services to stabilize them, you can have tremendous amount of savings. So for example, there's a lot of cases where, it's been documented where some of the most chronic homeless in communities will use anywhere from $60,000 to $100,000 per year of services, from ER visits, jail, police contacts, that type of thing. It's very common to see those kinds of studies. And so when you look at a housing first type of model, typically, they can run from $20,000 to $30,000. So you can save a tremendous amount of money from the community by doing this. So there's a big economic driver that makes sense here. Go ahead. So what I want to talk about is we've been doing a pilot on Milpas, and some of us in the room here have been involved in it. I saw Sharon Burns here, and Susan Gardner has been a part of it, and Emily and Alice and Zara. And what we did was we looked at what was going on in Milpas, and we got the business community together, the Milpas Community Association, along with the service providers and restorative policing and the VA, and everyone, all of us at the table, and we decided on going after some of the folks that were the most chronic on Milpas, the ones that were causing the most impact to the community there as far as the businesses and so forth, but also the most vulnerable as well. And we targeted 10 individuals, and we just went after really trying to figure out what it is they need and how do we get them off the streets. In each case, it was different. There was mental illness, and there was addiction, and there was a lot of issues there. Each person is an individual story, but we got everyone at the table with the right amount of resources, and we were able to actually get, so to date, we've gotten 9 of those 10 off the street after about a year. We've just been picking our next group of folks to work on, and we've been able to get them stabilized and get them in a much better place. So right now we're putting the data together that shows how much money we've actually saved the community, because we have before and after data, individual data on these folks, and so we can show how their ER visits have gone down, their police contacts have gone down, hospitalization and jail time has gone down. So, and the idea was with Milpas was to use this as a pilot to show that this really works. And then now we've expanded to State Street. We just started a State Street project as well. So it's only been a few weeks now, or a month or so, that we've been doing State Street. But the same thing, we get the downtown organization together, which is key, and we get the service providers together. We get the VA there. We get the county mental health is at the table, and we just start working the issue. We just came up with our list yesterday at our meeting of who we're going to go after, and we just start really going after the individuals and try and make an impact to that region. And I think the model here is that if you look at the homeless issue and you look at the county and all the data we've seen, you're just like, oh my gosh, this thing is out of control. But if you start to look at it neighborhood by neighborhood, region by region, and you just look at it specifically what's going on and really trying to impact that area, and then you take that model and you move it to the different regions. I really believe that we can make a change here. So that's the housing first, which is a service-based model that we've been using. And the next one I want to talk about is what is a program that my colleague Glenn Batchelor put together at Social Venture Partners, and this is looking at the housing side. How do we increase housing stock? And so what he found is that when he looked at the data, that Santa Barbara community is a lot like any other community, and that 90% of the units available are privately owned, and about 10% are owned what we might call public or with nonprofits. And so the opportunity, obviously, if we're not going to build more units, is that if we can get some of the units that are in the private sector through landlords to help us, there's an opportunity to increase some of the housing. Go ahead. So what Glenn found was a program up in Seattle which has been very effective, and really it's working with the landlords to try and understand what their needs would be to helping this situation. And so in Seattle, they were able to put this program together, and they've housed over 4,000 people in 4 years. So it's been a really big success in Seattle. And so basically the way it works is that the Landlord Liaison Program, the LLP, works between the social services and the private landlords. And it creates a relationship there that both sides can benefit from. And so from the agency side, the service provider side, what they do is they provide the clients, and then the Landlord Liaison Program helps match those with private landlords, but also make sure that the landlords feel comfortable with the clients. And so some of the key things here is that, first of all, it's designed in collaboration with the landlords. So Glenn got together with a lot of the landlords and a lot of the landlord associations and talked to them about what would it take for you to help, to help reduce this problem. And really, it's pretty simple if you think about it. What does a landlord want? It wants the rent paid on time. It wants things not broken, and it wants things. It wants the tenant not to disturb the neighbors. It's pretty simple, right? And if you can do those things, that's all they really care about. And then what we also find, obviously, is that landlords and property owners, like the rest of us, really want to see a change in this area too. So they're very willing to step up and help veterans and help people who have these needs. So some of the key is that what we find is that we're looking. It's a different type of maybe a different type of client than we talked about before with the Housing First. These clients maybe are a little bit farther up the self-sufficiency scale and can be a little more self-sustained in these units. So we're looking at tenants that are ready to succeed. We're providing a hotline to the landlords, so they have someone to call when there is an issue. It's not their problem. There's supportive services that are appropriate to the individual that come with the tenant. So that is provided by the service provider who brings them to the program. So, for example, if CASA or Salvation Army or one of those bring them to the program, they would bring case workers to help make sure that person's successful. There's mediation if needed. The big piece of it is a financial safety net. So a big piece of it is this program will provide landlords with a safety net there. So there's a minimum financial risk to them when things get broken or whatever. There's monies that can be help pay for that. There's insurance and so forth that are provided with this program. I think that's about it.
Great.
Right? Great. Thank you.
So I think now we'll have a moment to stretch, grab some coffee, tea, and then after a few moments, we'll come back and you'll have a chance to ask questions of the panel. So think about your questions during the break. You ready? Okay. Welcome back. And now we will do questions and answers. So Carol, you have the microphone and you can raise your hand if you have a question and we will attempt to answer it.
Is somebody else going to ask a question, or should I go ahead? Okay. I think what you're doing and what you presented today is outstanding, without a doubt. There's one component, though, which I don't believe that any of you or your organization should deal with, and that is the root cause. What we're treating is the symptom, and that's important. But we also have to look into what commonality there is among homeless, and maybe many causes. But once we understand the causes, we can start to address those and really reduce homelessness to a great extent. And unfortunately, like the medical profession, they're very often treating symptoms, not causes.
No, you got it. That's it. That's absolutely right. You're right. I was just saying he was right. It's homelessness is a symptom of something bigger, whether it's poverty, whether it's mental illness,
Lack of affordable
housing. That's part. But I think what's different now that I've seen, and being at City Hall now my 11th year, is trying to connect different agencies who don't normally talk to each other to finally talk to each other and figure out the core source of what the issue is.
Keep it up.
There's a really interesting video that I just saw a couple days ago that came out of a program in LA, and it actually has a room full of investors, and they're being encouraged to invest in something new, and it turns out it's a person who's experiencing homelessness, and it's a program that really focuses on training people for jobs. And I think, we've got to look at, mental health and healthcare needs, and that's one solution sometimes, but also job opportunities, that's another solution. So I was impressed with that video.
Can I ask my question? My question is, how come we can build luxury housing when we have a water shortage? And I think that impacts on affordable housing.
Boy, there's a lot of policy issues in that one statement. My goodness. I'll take a stab at that. I was just telling someone else about we need more diverse housing, and that was talked about. And the city of Santa Barbara just updated its general plan to change away from incentivizing large luxury condos and instead incentivizing rental housing units and smaller units. And actually, we're seeing things move now and going through our system of in areas that are now looking at a number of a couple hundred actually rental housing units. So as it deals with water, in fact, the biggest water user is irrigation of lawns. So if you look at our city data, that's where the biggest water is. It's more about not what happens inside the house, it's what happens outside the house. So I guess one could argue, we could say that, having a variety of housing and focusing more on efficient water use inside the house and not having as much irrigation will help the water situation. But water is, boy, we could be here for hours to talk about water. I can come back to that one. I know more about water than I ever thought I would, but.
And real quickly, I'll just interject, I was going to end with this, but it seems on point. On Tuesday, March 31st at noon is the Water Committee of the League of Women Voters, and you're invited to that. It's at the League office.
There you go.
A couple of things. I really liked what I heard. I think it's definitely a community endeavor to make it a holistic process. I like what you ended with, and it being a person-centered approach. It's about meeting the consumer's needs, regardless of what type of consumer they are. And what was I going to say? I'm sorry. Concern I have is someone had mentioned, and I apologize, I don't know who it was, but getting housing first, that's good and dandy, and then not having any obligation to being compliant to treatment or services or whatever. And I think that's good for certain parties, but for some of those that are really vulnerable, some of them have, honestly, because of trauma and neglect and just they need some kind of compliance, some kind of structure, so that they don't destroy the property. They don't know how to live. They don't know how to live within the confines of four walls. So it's like finding the happy medium. How do you screen for that? That's a little bit of a concern for me. I mean, I'm kind of one of those. I'm privileged in that I have family and stuff, but I'm on disability, and I would fit that group. Like where I probably would not need to be compliant in certain ways, but I do have special considerations. So what's the workaround? What's the balancing act in that? How do you address that?
I can address that a little bit. So Emily talked about the VI SPDAT, which is the new survey instrument that we used this year, and it's a vetted tool. It really is an assessment tool, so we're gathering person-specific data about the individuals in our community, but it also allows us to link that individual with the right housing intervention. So Housing First may not be for every single person. Some folks are newly homeless. They maybe just need some short-term rental assistance. Others that are chronically homeless may have more profound needs and need supportive housing. Maybe Housing Ready is the right approach, maybe Housing First. So that is getting us closer to choosing the right interventions for the right individuals.
What interventions are you talking about? What is supportive housing?
So permanent supportive housing is the idea that you're providing an affordable housing unit linked with on-site services. So using El Carrillo as an example, there's 61 efficiency studios, but there's 3 clinical staff members on site, a substance abuse specialist and 2 clinicians that are there to really support folks in retaining their housing and in improving their well-being.
And another thing with the Housing First model, there's sort of a good philosophy of the person isn't required to participate in any specific service, but the team that's supporting that person is required to keep showing up, keep offering the services, keep working with the person to identify, what they want and helping them achieve that.
And I think Common Ground, too, part of what they do, and for people who want to volunteer and help individuals, is you don't have to be a licensed social worker to help someone who's just been housed, just to be a friend who can help. I mean, if you think about it, and I've heard stories of people who've been on the streets for decades who now have a place of their own, and the thought of, well, what do you put in a refrigerator? Or, my gosh, I have a light switch of my own. Or, how do I use this microwave oven? I mean, things that we just take for granted by living in shelter, it's foreign after you've been on the streets for so long. To have someone who is not there as a clinical social worker person that you need, but in addition, have someone whose sole purpose is just to be there and a friend and just help you succeed in housing is another component, I think, of the supportive services that can and should and is available.
And one other just quick comment too is that there's something that we call a continuum of care, and there's independent living, but there are also people that need a higher level of care. We need to have licensed board and cares and other community-based models for housing. There's a big, spectrum of need.
Hi. Perhaps I missed something, but I'm curious to know, how do you go about making the selection of these participants? And what I may have heard or misunderstood was it's a 6-year average waiting list. So are you saying that homeless people are hopscotching over the tops of single moms or others who've been long on the list?
Do you want to talk? Yes, I'll take that. There's different efforts underway. So I was describing the biweekly housing placement working group that is addressing homelessness throughout the county. The agency that I work for has a preference on our Section 8 waiting list for highly ranked individuals, meaning vulnerable, chronically homeless families or individuals within the city of Santa Barbara. So, but we have 7,000 other applicants. So, we're just trying to make it more accessible. It's not even coming close to meeting the need. And then other jurisdictions are deciding, what sort of preferences they want to have. County Housing Authority, for example, is handling it a different way. So I don't think we're trying to ignore the needs of families or single moms, or certainly not seniors. We have 2 senior developments in pre-development right now. So I just look at it as us tackling this issue in a little bit more of a direct way, but I don't see it as happening at the expense of the other folks that we're serving.
And, how people get on some of these lists. We've done the vulnerability survey, 3 years now. We can actually do surveys in between. So if somebody comes in, if one of our teams of volunteers encounters somebody who is very vulnerable, they can do the survey with them. And one thing that they're signing by doing the survey is consent. It needs to be that they've, consented to have the assistance of people to help them connect with housing and services. So that's sort of the first step.
It's Gordon. I've been homeless in Santa Barbara for 5 years. I just want to address the list issue. I'm not hopscotching over anybody. I have my personal list here. I'm number 350. I was number 352 On July 3rd of last year, I'm now number 423. I'm not hop, skipping, or jumping over anybody to get housing. I'm still homeless after 5 years.
What list is that?
County list.
Oh, county. Yeah.
That's the same on the city. I can find out what the city list is. It's pretty much the same story.
Mayor Schneider, I really like the idea that you stated that people can be friends to people who are transitioning into housing, and they haven't been there for a long time, and again, maybe they're, mental health issues, other things that are identifiable, that they do need someone to address the really basic things and help them out. I think that's wonderful. And I was wondering how, if that is established, that program is in place currently, and if so, how does one volunteer or become, or who would one contact to become one of those individuals who would like to help?
Yeah, the common ground. Did you want-
Yeah. So Stephen, raise your hand. Stephen is our South County Volunteer Coordinator for Common Ground, and our website is commongroundsb.org. And Stephen, the phone number, which I give out all.
451-5604.
I got the 805, but that's...
451
Okay.
5604.
451-5604.
And they're teams that do street outreach and housing support, so depending, and also other needs, from doing a sock and supply drive, or, sponsoring a meal share at a housing site. There are all sorts of ways you can help out.
My alley.
Great.
And I just want to add, our web address information is up here, so if you want to go online, you can also send an email through, I know at least for the C3H website, you can reach me, and then I can refer you on to Stephen.
And I should say on our website also, we list other nonprofits that also need volunteers. So, there are lots of volunteer opportunities.
You won't be bored.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, Amy Winslow. I'm with Sanctuary Centers. We're a mental health provider here in Santa Barbara, and we also have 36 units of affordable housing, actually the next block over, and we're in the early stages of building another building right there that would provide, I think, another 40 units. I was just wondering from Tom, for the landlord program, how do you, how's your funding obtained? And, from the Seattle program, how have they been able to sustain the funding all the 4 years?
Yeah, that's a good question. The funding for the startup, we've gotten funding from the Santa Barbara Housing Authority, the City Housing Authority, and the County Housing Authority, and also some other foundation and private donations to get it started. And long term, I think it's going to be a similar type of a model, I believe. So.
I was going to ask a question about the funding as well. When the state eliminated the redevelopment agency, as I recall, Santa Barbara was spending it, and maybe the whole county, was spending it largely on affordable housing. Have you been able to replace those funds at all? Or is part of the problem that there isn't enough funding to build more affordable housing? Or is it just that we will never be able to build our way out of the problem?
That's a great question. The short answer is no, we haven't replaced the funding. There are over 400 redevelopment agencies, or there were, in the state. And the way redevelopment agencies worked is that agencies had to spend a minimum of 20% of the funding on affordable housing capital projects, so not rental assistance, not operations, but actual capital. And statewide, it was $1 billion a year. So that's gone. So it was a couple $1 million a year for the city, and so we would pool that money and then partner with the housing authority or other nonprofit housing providers who was actually building the housing. So what do you do next? So there was Prop 41, a drop in the bucket compared to RDAs, but that's funding for veterans' homes. There's tax credits. There's federal funding, but and the state is continuing to look at how to replace what was there. But frankly, I don't see how the state going to create something that's going to create the same amount of funding, because the reason why the governor eliminated redevelopment agencies was so the state could have the money for their budget. So they're not going to necessarily give that up unless there's some connectivity there. And there have been some proposals here and there. There are a couple of housing statewide proposals, which really I think the league, as the league would be a great opportunity to follow up. I know Housing California, and there's some other statewide housing advocacy groups that follow state legislation on housing options. That might be something the league wants to look at. So that's why the landlord liaison project, or master leasing, and especially in a city where we have such a low vacancy rate, we don't have abandoned buildings you could just convert into, affordable housing. We just don't have that kind of stock. It's very important. City of Goleta will be interesting. The City of Goleta is building a lot of new market rate, but still new housing, and so that might free up some of the vacancy rates. We're looking at that, as I mentioned, with the change in our general plan of new rentals, but that takes time. And so yeah, it's something I know I've been talking to with other housing providers. I think it will take some statewide legislation to try to find some designated funding for new product. And it's not even just new housing. I mean, I'm sure Alice can tell you a lot of the city housing authority stock is stuff that was built 40 years ago that needs upgrades. I mean, those capital improvements are absolutely necessary, and we need to figure out the funding for that as well.
One thing, as part of the alcohol, drug, and mental health system redesign, the committees that have been meeting, there is a committee that's looking at, what can the county do around this, specifically starting to look at some of the grants that come up, from state, national grants for building affordable housing. Are we going after all of the different funding that is available? Do we have projects that are ready to go? Because that's often a requirement, that you have to have a project ready to go to really go after that. And, not just housing, this committee is recommending also looking at things like the master leasing, things that other communities are doing around the country to create more, units of affordable housing.
Well, two. One is whether I know since the redevelopment agency is not funded, there are a number of used to be rapid rehousing programs and funds that are just not there. And is there anyone doing that rapid rehousing work for people that are more newly homeless? Or there are professionals now that are in this category that have donated and worked and, been productive community members for decades, and they can't get housing. Even people with vouchers aren't able to get housing because landlords either don't think, that the housing is kept up with the market rent standards, and for some reason, they have legitimate reasons that they need to get a certain amount of rent for their property. So, there's, legitimate things on both sides of the landlord-tenant equation, but there's this gap, and I don't know whether the financial gap is being addressed in like the voucher programs, and then I'm wondering if there is any intake point for this rapid rehousing, because the point about everyone has a different story is so true, and I think that would be a great potential there for getting data that would be important now and in the future, but also a central intake point, because if somebody goes, for one thing to one agency and another thing here, it doesn't seem to end up necessarily solving the problem. They're getting, some advice here and some advice there, but they don't get housed.
Yeah. Just to be clear, the rapid rehousing was not redevelopment agency money. Again, redevelopment agency money was just capital, just bricks and mortar, building the stuff. There was, through the federal stimulus money, a section of rapid rehousing funds, and there was a program available, and I think Zara wanted to take on from
Yeah,
there.
you make a lot of excellent points. There are some dollars in the community that go toward rapid rehousing. I know that through the city of Santa Barbara, for example, a certain portion of their tenant-based rental assistant funds go toward that. Is it enough? Does it get at all of the issues that you're mentioning? No. I mean, we're still dealing with a very, very low vacancy rate. All of the other issues that you mentioned, the difficulties leasing up, still present. So that's why, as everyone has emphasized, we really have to look at these creative housing solutions and other ways of addressing the issue.
And the other thing that you really touch on is something that's really would be moving us to what we would call a coordinated entry system. And as we mentioned, the VI SPDAT gives you a better idea of what does somebody need, what sort of intervention. And, housing first or supportive housing are two of the interventions, but rapid rehousing is another, and that's providing people with rental assistance and other, help in finding housing. So it is a critical piece also.
Maybe that fits in with the question that Judy and I had. One of the things that's so discouraging is to house a bunch of people and then find the number on the street is roughly the same year after year. And we were wondering if there isn't some way to keep people from being forced onto the street. If we could create a system for giving small loans to help people pay the rent when they're going to be evicted, very often maybe they could get on their feet, and there's been a marvelous record of people repaying loans of that kind when it saves their housing. I thought maybe social ventures could look into that and see if there's any way to set up a rotating loan fund and let them pay it back so that they don't get put on the street in the first place.
That's an excellent idea.
Good idea.
Okay, Tom. You have your work, but I also want to bring up, and I mean, I think when I first moved here, I was subletting someone with a studio and who was away for the summer, and I had to find a place. And when we finally found a place, we needed a big deposit as well as the rent. And and this is, it was fine doing the rent. It was just that upfront money. And thank goodness for Grandpa. I mean, he was my rapid rehouser funder. I mean, that, and it's all right. You with a one, and then that was all I needed. I just needed that little push, and then it was self-sustaining after that. It was just fine. Grandfather. He never liked being called Grandpa. But two things, though, I think that one, the microloans, the kind of thing, is a great example. I also there are a couple of things happening in the city that always need support. That it's one of those policy issues that any given Tuesday 4 council members could change. One is the now I'm spacing on the name, the Rental Housing Mediation Task Force, which is an unusual thing for a city to fund and house. And actually, it's a mediation process. We actually appoint volunteer mediators who work with one staff person in the city. So when landlords and tenants have issues, instead of going straight to an eviction or to a court or something, there's a mediation process that basically solves most of the issues before there's an eviction and someone's left out without a home. And it helps both the landlords and the tenants. That used to be funded by the federal government. When that funding went away, it took quite a while and 4 votes of the council, ended up being, I think, 6 at the end, to use general fund discretionary funds to fund it. So that is now part of the process, but that's a decision that council makes every year. The second thing and I know this has been coming up more about upgrading homes, upgrading apartments from families to other sectors of the rental community, where a landlord might say, look, I can get X amount of rent, but if I renovate this place, I can charge 3 times as much. It's still a rental property, but I'm displacing families who've been here for it's the gentrification process, other people who might be willing to pay more. The city of Santa Barbara does have a condo conversion ordinance that gives tenant displacement funds if a place goes from a rental to a condo. We don't have a just cause eviction ordinance, for example, that the county actually has, that would at least, at the very least, help tenants who might be displaced because of an upgrade of a property to at least get another place, or help them with funding to move to another place. And I know a couple council members and I, we've been talking about, is this something that's worth pursuing, and at least monitor how the county did it.
I'm concerned about children in this picture, and maybe you stated it and I missed it, but I'm wondering what percentage in your figures are families with children, and are there efforts afoot to keep those children in their first school? Because we know how disorienting it is for kids to move from school to school, and then we lose track of them as well.
Zara, if you have numbers.
So I can't, unfortunately, give you the number of families with children off the top of my head. That is data that's being collected. We don't have quite as much access to some of the information that's coming out of the family shelters. So that's something that we're working to try and integrate with this broader picture, because we do know that there are many, many children who are, parts of families who are experiencing homelessness and the impacts. One of the other things to be aware of is that this data set that we presented and what we collect for the purpose of providing to the federal government is based on a pretty narrow definition of homelessness. And because we can only survey individuals who are over 18, we're not always getting through this process as many details about the various circumstances that families might find themselves in. But there's different data that comes out of the school districts that does have some of those numbers based on a slightly different definition of homelessness. So this it gets at another issue. There are different definitions for different purposes, and it is very complex. But we have within the county 2 really strong family shelter providers. We have Transition House here in South County. We have Good Samaritan up in North County that are working as part of the collaborative. And we hope to look at programs that will specifically serve families as well. So that's another population that we can look at trying to place through landlord liaison at some point.
And also the federal opening doors, which a lot of these efforts, align with, has other goals around youth homelessness and family homelessness. So, I think a lot of times those would require, I think, a more detailed conversation specific to those, groups of people.
Hi, I'm one of those who firmly believe, and I use the word gentrification is one of the greatest causes of homelessness. I have a kind of a zoning question. I remember there's a group of condos built across the street from the Casa de la Raza. And when it was zoned, what it was zoned for, what I thought was everybody was saying it was for low income, for our police officers and our fire department to have a place to find affordable housing. And now, all of a sudden, it's a $1 million condos there, and there's problems in the neighborhood. So I'm just wondering, is there something in the zoning, in our zoning rules, that can stop that process from changing from what it was supposed to be built for to what it is now?
So that project, it was never low income. It was workforce housing that goes beyond the federal definition of subsidized housing. The idea was to allow middle income folks the ability still to live and work here. And long story short, after a variety of planning processes, most of the units there are still income restricted and resale restricted based on a formula. There are a few units there that are market rate, and at the end of the day, if we have done this, if we know now what we knew then, if we knew then what we know now, we may have done something different. But there are less number of units than was originally planned, and some of the units there are market rate, and the housing developer actually is mitigating that with another project near Oak Park that's making for other workforce housing. So this is housing that does not get any federal subsidy, but it does have a cap of how you can resell it, so it doesn't go with the market. So that's still in place, but it wasn't the way it was originally envisioned in terms of the number of units or the percentage that all of it would be workforce housing. And this is and that's why I think with the general plan update that we went through, it's going to be interesting to see how this works with this, what is known as a area unit density zone, which is basically incentivizing smaller units in one area. So you don't have big bulky condos, you have lots of little ones, and it doesn't create the big size, bulk, scale concerns that people have here in the city, and actually have a density overlay. It's what it's called if you're doing a rental property versus a condo. But again, even that's not subsidized housing. Will be market rate rentals. It'll still be more rentals than we have, and so that's part of the thought process moving forward, and we're going to monitor this to see how much it's working. But if you may recall, I know the League of Women Voters was very much involved with the Planned Santa Barbara update. Took 5 years instead of 2.5, and density was the big D word, and where and how many houses, where was it, how would it look, and so this was the way we got to, in fact, a unanimous vote. We needed a supermajority vote to get there. So I hope that answers your question.
Maybe one last question, if there is one. Okay. Yeah, and so go ahead. One last question.
I was just thinking about the homeless, and I know this is also a nationwide issue for those that actually are kind of nomadic or want to stay local and live off the grid, but don't want to be arrested for being homeless. I mean, how do you give those people a place to have and call their own and be autonomous and choose to live the way they want freely? I guess technically it is a housing issue. It's just they look at housing different. They're kind of a unique, quote unquote, feral species, and many of them are my friends. So I want to look out for them too. So what do we do for them?
I mean, I'll just say, I think some of the enforcement issues that I hear about from folks on State Street or other areas, it's not necessarily whether or not you are homeless or not homeless. It's behavior that is exhibited, some of it inappropriate behavior, some of it aggressive behavior, and some people who are exhibiting that behavior actually go to a place with a bed with a roof every night. So I think, and that's what I was talking about, the restorative policing process, and also these community service officers trying to deal with the more behavioral aspects of inappropriate behavior. And it's complicated when someone is also mentally ill or has a substance abuse concern, and how their behavior is exhibited because of those concerns. But I think what you're talking about are people who may just, like you said, live off the grid, and they're not mentally ill and they're not necessarily abusing of substances. However, if they're congregating outside areas and interacting with people in a way that makes them feel uncomfortable, that's a community neighborhood, good neighbor issue. And so, being homeless in and of itself is not illegal. Grabbing someone's food from a tray next to when they're eating in a patio dining area is a problem. That doesn't mean someone who did that is homeless. So I think it's just more dealing with trying to be good neighbors to one another and trying to interact with each other as a community, and saying no to behavior when it becomes appropriate, and providing services to those when we need to and where we can. If people are going to travel around, people travel around all the time, all over the country, and that's their right to do so. It's just trying to do it in a way that is community-based and not infringing on the rights of others as well is the balancing act. So.
Okay, thank you all, and this forum is, like many other of the league's forums, is being recorded, and so you can go to lwvsantabarbara.org. That's the league's website, and I know that the league also has a YouTube page, so you can also go to YouTube and look up the League of Women Voters of Santa Barbara to see videos. So thank you all again so much for being here. And like we said, there are a lot of ways to be involved, from attending those regional coordination meetings of C3H to volunteering. So, please feel free to come up after and talk to us about how you can be involved. Thank you.